You might think pirates spent most of their time swinging from rigging or shouting "air" at poor unfortunate souls. But their biggest enemy wasn't the British Navy or pesky mermaids. It was actually the quest for edible, non-maggoty food and dry, bite-worthy ship biscuits. Yeah, ship biscuits. Those rock-hard slabs of flour and water that could double as weapons if you swung them hard enough. Let me tell you something wild about making those biscuits like pirates did at sea. It wasn't just about baking bread. It was a battle for survival. A game of, will this keep me from starving or breaking a tooth today? And trust me, the solutions they stumbled upon were as salty and surprising as the ocean itself. So picture this. You're aboard a merchant or pirate ship in the late 1600s or early 1700s, maybe imagining Captain Kidd or Blackbeard lurking around the decks. You've got a crew of about 50 salty scallywags, and you're weeks, maybe months out to sea. The winds are unpredictable. Storms might pop up any second in your ship's stores. Well, they come packed away in those infamous 63-gallon barrels of hardtack, aka ship biscuits. These biscuits were supposed to be your bread, your cracker, your everything. But here's the kicker. They had to last for months, sometimes up to 6 months, without mold, weevils, or falling apart into dust at the mere hint of humidity. The problem was simple yet brutal. How the heck do you make a biscuit that doesn't turn into a crumbly, weevil-filled mess, or worse, a breeding ground for worms and nasty fungi? Pirates couldn't just pop down to the nearest bakery, or even worse, turn on their ovens like you do at home. Ships didn't have fancy kitchens. Meals were more about survival than gourmet dining. Now these biscuits, called hardtack, ship's biscuit, pilot bread, or even dog biscuits by rival crews because of their toughness, had to be baked dry enough to last, but not so dry they shattered to dust the moment you tried biting them. And since the average pirate needed at least 4 ounces of these biscuits every day, for a crew of 50, that's a minimum of roughly 12.5 pounds of biscuits consumed daily, all of it stored on a ship, constantly battling moisture and heat. Spoiler alert, it didn't always go well. Here's where it gets both funny and a little gross. Pirates and sailors tried some truly awful ideas to deal with biscuit spoilage. One legendary failure was storing the biscuits near the ship's water casks in hopes the humidity would keep them from cracking. A bad idea, really bad idea. Moisture's worst enemy number 1, molds and weevils, happy bugs that love to invade those barrels with a vengeance. So instead of dry, crunchy biscuits, crews ended up with soggy biscuit bricks crawling with tiny weevil larvae. Those little white wormy critters that make biscuits look less like food and more like a science experiment gone horribly wrong. You can probably guess how that ended. 50 pirates staring at what they thought was their dinner, only to start spitting and making faces that would have made any captain want to jump ship. Because nothing says fearsome pirate like a crew simultaneously gagging over their own food supplies. And of course, there was the pirate innovation of dunking biscuits into grog or seawater to soften them up. Now, I'm pretty sure dipping hardtack into seawater was less about flavor and more about desperation. Dunking your biscuit in salt water basically made things worse. It dissolved the salt barrier protecting the biscuits from mold and actually encouraged bacterial growth. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation. Picture a hardened pirate who's supposed to be fierce but ends up chewing on a soggy, salty mess that tastes like the ocean threw up on it. Plus, the grog solution wasn't much better. Alcohol helped some but only masked the biscuit's underlying texture problems temporarily. It was like trying to cover a ship's rotten plank with a coat of paint. Temporarily distracting but not a solution. But pirates had to figure out a better way fast. After all, if your biscuits crumbled before you finished eating them or got infested with worms, your whole crew was at risk of scurvy, starvation, and mutiny. Here's where the real genius kicked in. Pirates accidentally stumbled on baking techniques and storage methods that would look pretty familiar if you're a fan of vacuum sealing or freeze drying. Except they had to do all this without electricity or fancy gadgets. The key was baking the biscuits not once but twice, making them ultra-dry and almost rock-hard. This process, called double baking, drove out moisture to about 3.5% water content, low enough to prevent mold growth and kill any bugs hiding inside. Think of it like a pirate's version of modern freeze-drying, except with more flour and less science. They started shaping these biscuits into perfect squares or circles, about 3 inches wide and half an inch thick, to optimize baking. Each biscuit could last a sailor for a day, stored carefully in barrels lined with cloth or in wooden cases called bread baskets to keep out moisture and pests. Turns out pirates had stumbled on the ancient art of preservation through extreme dryness, which, by some miracle, worked 70% of the time. They didn't know the science behind it, they just knew their crews weren't dying of starvation or scurvy as often anymore. A historical story to chew on. On the infamous ship Whydah Galley, Black Sam Bellamy's flagship captured in 1717, archaeologists found ship's biscuits remarkably well preserved after centuries underwater. These biscuits were baked so solidly that they survived the shipwreck and remained intact enough to study. Apparently, Captain Bellamy's crew valued their biscuits like treasure, treating them as much for survival as they did their gold. Funny detail: some crews supposedly carved initials into their bread money, as ship biscuits were sometimes called, almost like pirate currency on long voyages. I guess even pirates had sentimental moments for their rations. So to sum up what happened when you tried making ship biscuits like pirates did. The challenge was battling moisture, time, and bugs in a tiny, swaying box with no pantry or fridge in sight. Early attempts to store biscuits near water or damp sacks backfired horribly, inviting weevils and mold to parties no one wanted to attend. Dunking them in seawater or alcohol was a desperate yet mostly failed attempt to soften rock-like hardness. But through trial and error, pirates figured out double baking and smart storage, creating biscuits that lasted months, survived long storms, and kept the crew fed, even if it meant chewing on something that could also serve as a doorstop when meals ran out. It's basically their version of a water treatment plant meets food preservation system. Clunky, crude, but surprisingly effective given the circumstances. And just wait until we dive into the next challenge: how pirates tackled their biggest liquid problem, their water supply, which was even grosser and more complicated than biscuits. Because if you think chewing on biscuits loaded with tiny bugs is bad, imagine having only gross, stagnant water to wash them down with. But for now, remember, those little slabs of ancient rock-hard biscuits were not just dried bread. They were survival, ingenuity, and a testament to the fact that pirates were just as much food scientists and engineers as they were swashbuckling marauders. Stay tuned, because the next chapter in pirate survival is even wetter and grosser, but trust me, it's worth every salty drop. Alright, so you've survived the ship biscuit ordeal and somehow kept your teeth mostly intact, but now comes the real kicker: water. You might think pirates just dipped a bucket and called it a day, but no, their biggest liquid problem wasn't just finding water. It was finding water that didn't taste like wet barnacle or worse, didn't make you puke after one sip. Picture this: 50 pirates, each needing at least a gallon to a gallon and a half of fresh water every single day for drinking, cooking, and the occasional bucket bath. That's at least 50 gallons daily, and the ship's water casks, those 63-gallon barrels again, were supposed to hold that precious supply for weeks, even months, out on the roughest seas. But here's the catch: fresh water on a wooden sailing ship is like gold dust mixed with snake venom. It could spoil fast, get infested with nasty microorganisms, or literally turn bad enough to cause diarrhea outbreaks that help start more mutinies than any captain's harsh words. Bad idea, really bad idea. So what did pirates do? Well, the obvious answer is to store water, but just filling barrels and hoping for the best wasn't exactly a winning strategy. Water in poorly cleaned casks could turn into a slurry of slime, with floating chunks of God knows what and eyes staring back at you. Okay, maybe not actual eyes, but definitely things you didn't want getting into your bloodstream. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Pirates tried scooping seawater into barrels and letting it settle, hoping the salt would somehow magically vanish, or at least that the barrel's wood would filter out the nastiness. Nope. Let's just say it wasn't pretty. More than one pirate ended up sympathetic to the idea that maybe sticking a sword in your own gut was a less painful fate than drinking from the ship's freshwater stores. Pirates called it brackish, basically a gross mix between swamp water and salt water that had the texture of eye mucus and the taste to match. What about boiling the water to kill microbes? In the cramped galley, boiling a few pots was doable, but doing it for 50 gallons a day, not so much. Plus, the fire risk was huge, especially with all the wood and tar on board. The ship's chef looked more like a pyromaniac praying for patience while the crew snarled in thirst. Boiling also used precious fuel, something pirates needed for cooking salted meat, not saintly water purification. So boiling was a nice dream, but the reality, pirates essentially had to get creative. Here's where it gets interesting. Pirates figured out something clever. Since fresh water spoiled so fast, why not just keep taking advantage of what the ocean naturally provided, rain? Yes, rainwater collection was the pirate version of a low-tech water treatment plant. Pirates stretched their sails to catch rain, cleverly angling them to funnel water into barrels and casks. Some ships even rigged up canvas catchments to maximize every drop during the frequent storms at sea. This method was surprisingly effective in rainy seasons, reducing the need to drink brackish water that tasted like a combination of algae and regret. But of course, pirates couldn't just sit there waiting for rain like a bunch of landlubbers praying for a drought to end. Rainwater storage had to be clean, easy to access, and protected from contamination. They lined their casks carefully and kept them sealed, turning the process into a crucial daily ritual on board that often decided who stayed sober enough and who didn't. One hilarious anecdote comes from the notorious Captain Bartholomew Roberts, aka Black Bart, who ruled the Caribbean in the early 1700s. His crew got so good at rainwater harvesting that their fresh water was the envy of nearby ships, who sneered at their own brackish supplies. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation. Picture pirates gleaming with pride because their water didn't taste like rotten fish guts. Roberts reportedly had his men polish their rain catchers religiously and even ration water like gold, which is pretty sophisticated for a bunch of pirates who'd otherwise spend their day chasing barrels of rum. But rain wasn't the only trick pirates used. They also heavily relied on alcohol, not just for bawdy songs and mad parties, but as a sort of primitive disinfectant. Grog, the famous pirate drink, was a mix of water, rum, and sometimes lime juice, which, as it turns out, made it safer to drink than pure rainwater stored in barrels for weeks. The alcohol content killed some bacteria, and the lime juice contributed vitamin C, helping stave off scurvy. So yes, pirates were downing their vitamin C as much to keep disease at bay as to dull the pain of chewing ship biscuits. Not exactly the healthiest diet, but pretty clever. The downside: drink too much grog, and you're as useless as a parrot on a fishhook. But at least your stomach wouldn't revolt as often. Before leaving water behind, one last failure story. Pirates tried the dreaded practice of fermenting seawater into vinegar-like liquids, hoping the acidity would purify it. Spoiler alert, it didn't work the way they hoped. Instead of sanitizing, it brewed sour, rancid puddles that smelled like a combination of rotting seaweed and old socks. Crews who accidentally drank this discovered mutiny was less about the captain's orders and more about what was in their drinking cup. Pretty gnarly for a bunch of men who prided themselves on daring sea raids. So water was an endless challenge, but as it turns out, their biggest dry and liquid problems had an odd connection: preservation through lack of moisture. The ship biscuits were all about driving out water, and the water itself was salvaged from moisture in the air and rain, filtered by wood and cloth, and sometimes spiked with alcohol to keep it from turning fatal. Pirates were, whether they liked it or not, pioneers of preservation science. Let's zoom out for a second. Thinking back to those 63-gallon barrels of ship biscuits and water, storing and rationing food and drink that would last months on unpredictable seas was the unsung art of piracy. It wasn't just about sailing and fighting. It was a high-stakes experiment in survival. Without dry, long-lasting biscuits that could double as nails and barrels of water that didn't kill you on the spot, pirates might just have been better off swimming home. Instead, these masters of the sea became accidental food scientists, engineers of drying and storage, and the original masters of low-tech preservation. The next time you bite into a cracker or pop open a bottle of purified water, remember that there's a bit of pirate ingenuity and a lot of trial, error, and wiggling worms in every bite and sip. So there you have it. What happens when you make ship biscuits like pirates did at sea? You get a survival story smeared with salt, crushed bugs, soggy mistakes, and brilliant dry baking techniques. And what about water? You get a grim tale of brackish failure, rain-catching miracles, and grog-fueled life support systems. Pirate life was less about gold and treasure, and more about mastering the science of snail-slow preservation and finding fresh drops on a salty sea. Because if you think stormy battles and buried chests made piracy tough, try eating crunchy, worm-riddled biscuits and drinking swamp water for months while hoping you don't starve or die of disease. Pirates might not be your typical heroes, but when it came to survival innovation, they earned their stripes, even if those stripes came with a side of mold and magnificent weird smells. Next time you think pirates just yelled air and swung swords, remember, they were also the original snack tech geeks of the sea, battling bugs, mold, and bad water with nothing but flour, rain, rum, and stubbornness. That's real pirate spirit, tough, resourceful, and slightly disgusting. But hey, that's what kept the legends alive. So cheers to ship biscuits and sailing water, the true unsung heroes of pirate survival, one crunchy bite and suspiciously salty sip at a time.